witnesses for your testimony and your participation. Congress provided $65 billion for broadband in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act to fundamentally reshape the landscape of connectivity in the United States. The law deploys broadband, supports adoption, and requires new rules for inclusion and equity. This is a historic bipartisan commitment to close the digital divide and ensure that everyone is able to participate in the digital economy and our interconnected world. I want to acknowledge what we have accomplished so far. But now it's time to have a different conversation about putting those resources to work. Congress must ensure that our federal, tribal, state, and local partners are able to deploy these resources efficiently to address real need and not just maximize opportunities and profits. Every village, colonia, tribe, and pueblo in New Mexico and across the nation deserves equal access to the opportunities that this law provides. Congress has good reason to be vigilant regarding the use of these funds. It's going to be important that there are guardrails, prudent oversight, and that the investment flows to areas where it's needed most. Just as historic inequities and redlining in the housing and financial industries meant low income and communities of color were left unserved by housing and access to banking, digital redlining has resulted in worse service and higher prices for those same communities. An investigation published by The Markup in October in partnership with the Associated Press showed that many internet service providers offered their worst deals to formerly redlined neighborhoods. This article demonstrates why it is so important that the FCC implement meaningful new rules to prevent this digital discrimination related to broadband. As public and private partners deploy new broadband programs, Congress must ensure federal funds meet the needs on the ground, not deepen existing racial and socioeconomic inequities. We must also work with Administrator Davidson and the National Telecommunication and Information Administration to allocate funds according to the true state of access to affordable broadband as required by law. With the Broadband Data Act, Congress provided direction and funding to the Federal Communication Commission to develop cutting-edge broadband maps. These maps have already proven to be a leap forward in understanding broadband availability in the United States. I'm deeply grateful for the work Chairman Rosenworcel and the FCC have done in the area of implementing the Broadband Data Act, and NTIA will use these maps to make funding allocations for the $42.5 billion made available through the Broadband Equity, Access, and Deployment, which we'll probably be calling B today. But the initial version of these maps still needs work. The version largely relies on self-reported data from broadband providers. Now, the example that I'll give here shows where there was much data that was missing. Whole communities were missing from the fabric of these maps. Like in my state, Shiprock, New Mexico, which is out in the Four Corners on the Navajo Nation, and Cochiti Pueblo in New Mexico were not included. We cannot afford to get this wrong. Fortunately, the bill recognized that local communities have the best knowledge of their own connectivity issues, and it required the FCC to include a robust challenge process. We want to encourage everyone across the country to learn about this challenge process, to learn about the app that was developed by the Federal Communication Commission, learn how to use it, and just check the speeds at your house or your business or your schools. And if they're not as reported on the map site, use the map and let's get better data. NTIA should ensure funding allocations use the most accurate data available. I will continue to work closely with the Commission and communities on the ground to ensure the maps represent the true state of broadband availability in New Mexico and across the country. We must also continue to find long-term solutions to make broadband access equitable across the United States. That's why I introduced the Digital Equity Foundation Act to create an ongoing source of funds for digital literacy, equity, and inclusion on an ongoing and sustained basis. As the pace of technological development continues to accelerate, we'll always have a divide between those who have access and those who need it. We must weave digital equity into the fabric of connectivity in America. This bill would supplement the existing digital equity program that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It would create a permanent foundation to ensure long-term nationwide initiatives that can truly reshape the future of the United States. In addition, through funding and working to strengthen digital equity for programs like BEAD and tribal broadband, and of course for affordable connectivity, we will need to find permanent funding for every one of these important priorities that we've worked on together. Today, tens of millions of Americans do not have a choice between internet service providers. Their options are limited to whoever has cable running to their apartment or fiber to their houses or wireless service in their valley. There are too many communities where market forces have failed. Congress acted to ensure that the millions of Americans who do not currently have access to affordable broadband gain access. I look forward to our discussion today that will focus on making that a reality and to identify additional needs that might require additional congressional action. I'm very honored that our witnesses joined us today, and Mr. Thune, all in person, which I certainly appreciate. Kimball Sikwatiwa, who is a fellow New Mexican, someone that I have enjoyed getting to know throughout the years and watching her work, who is the chair of the Connect New Mexico Council and Chief Technology Director for the Santa Fe Indian School. She's been a tireless advocate for connecting unconnected communities across New Mexico, and I deeply appreciate her presence today, and I look forward to hearing more about what's been accomplished and how it might help connect more people across America. Jonathan Spalter, who's the president and CEO of U.S. Telecom. The Broadband Association, U.S. Telecom represents a diverse set of telecommunication providers across the country working to expand connectivity through a variety of new and established technologies. The Honorable Michael Powell is president and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. Mr. Powell is former chairman of the Federal Communications Commission and now represents most of the cable market and some of the largest residential broadband providers in the United States. And finally, Angela Seifer, who is the executive director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. She's been a tireless advocate for digital inclusion and equity efforts nationwide. Thank you all for being here. I look forward to this conversation. And I would just add that this conversation is taking place at a time that we have 4 FCC commissioners. And I'm certainly hopeful that there's an up or down vote that can be scheduled on the Senate floor over Gigi Son's nomination, and I'm calling on a vote to take place. Many of us have been asking for a vote to take place for a while. There were several voices, including mine, that advocated for nominations a year before they took place, I think, and even reconfirmation of the chair and others. So I'm hopeful that we can have a full commission soon. One final note. While this might be my last opportunity to preside over a subcommittee hearing this year, my deepest thanks to Ranking Member Wicker, his tenure as the ranking Republican member of the Commerce Committee as well, who has shaped national broadband policy, including the Broadband Data Act and many others. Much of what we will discuss today were possible through the hard work of Senator Wicker and his staff to put these efforts in place, including Olivia Trustee, John Lynn, Kelsey Geiselman, Matthew Hamilton. The Armed Services Committee is going to be very fortunate to have Mr. Wicker as part of that committee as well. I also want to recognize Chair Cantwell and her staff for their support this Congress, including former staff John Branscombe, Sean Bone, Brian McDermott, and Mary Claire York, and then current staff Christy Barnhart, Mary Wang, and Harsha Mundalir and Wes Platt. I want to thank them all for the work that they do tirelessly every day, and then turn this over to Senator Thune.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for having today's hearing. And then let me just begin by saying that it's been a pleasure to lead this subcommittee with you these past couple of years, and I look forward to continue working with you on a number of important issues before this subcommittee next Congress. And one of those issues is ensuring that Americans have access to reliable broadband services. The expansion of these services to more rural areas has long been a priority of mine here in the United States Senate. And since March of 2020, Congress has allocated billions of dollars for broadband-related services through COVID-19 pandemic relief packages, and most recently through passage of the infrastructure bill, which provided broadband funding at a price tag of over $64 billion. The nearly $80 billion for broadband-specific projects, on top of the billions of dollars the FCC disperses annually under its Universal Service Fund, is an unprecedented amount of money. The good news is that for those areas where certain connectivity challenges remain unresolved, this funding, in addition to the sustained investments made by telecommunications providers across the country, should help close the digital divide. The bad news is that this funding is spread out over 15 separate agencies and 133 programs, with the lion's share of the funding going through NTIA. This is deeply concerning. As I argue in Congress was debating the infrastructure bill, NTIA has previously fumbled attempts to bring broadband access to more communities. Back in 2009, the stimulus bill allocated $4.7 billion to NTIA to expand broadband access in rural and underserved areas. It didn't go very well. The agency struggled with implementation. There were serious issues with a number of the projects the agency approved. Other projects resulted in a significant amount of overbuilding, meaning that they resulted in the construction of additional broadband infrastructure in areas that already had access to reliable broadband at the taxpayer's expense. More recently, last year, NTIA called for volunteers to help determine how to allocate the $1.5 billion Congress provided NTIA for certain broadband programs. That's unacceptable. And I'm afraid without stringent oversight, NTIA will make, and has already made, the same mistakes when managing the $42.5 billion Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program and Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. That is why last week I began an oversight effort to review the numerous federal broadband programs. Oversight of how these dollars are being spent is necessary to avoid agencies misusing billions of taxpayer dollars, and more importantly, to ensure the funding is actually going to areas that are truly unserved. If there are changes that need to be made to the various programs Congress has established, we need to get to work to make sure they are as effective as possible and that they work as Congress intended. One such program we've begun work to make necessary improvements to is USDA's Reconnect program. I was pleased to partner with Chair Luján and Senators Klobuchar and Fisher in introducing the Rural Internet Improvement Act, legislation that will streamline USDA's broadband authorities and target funding to areas most in need. We must also recognize the federal government will not solve the digital divide on its own. It's important we maintain a regulatory framework that promotes investment and allows telecommunications companies to make the kind of choices that have resulted in strong networks. Unlike other countries, broadband providers in the United States were able to keep Americans connected when demands for fixed and mobile networks soared during the pandemic. This is largely because of the United States' light-touch regulatory approach to broadband policy, which has incentivized the private sector to make network reliability, affordability, and resiliency a priority. Finally, we must tackle permitting hurdles that delay the build-out of broadband infrastructure. My Mobile Now Act, which was signed into law in 2018, has been an effective tool in moving the federal government in the right direction, but I continue to hear concerns about unnecessary delays and costs associated with broadband permitting. The agencies processing permitting requests need to be held accountable if they're not meeting deadlines, which is why today I'm sending requests to several federal agencies on the steps that they've taken to implement Mobile Now's broadband siting mandates. For too long, we've talked about bridging, the digital divide. It's time to actually do it. And the only way that happens is if this committee actually utilizes its important oversight responsibilities to ensure that agencies under its jurisdiction make smart, targeted investments that use taxpayer dollars responsibly. Anything short of that will result in government waste, leaving Americans still unconnected. I want to thank each of the witnesses for being here today, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Thune. I appreciate that, and we'll now recognize our witnesses for 5 minutes each for their testimony. And we'll begin with Kimball Siquaptiwa of New Mexico. Kimball?
Thank you, Chair Luján. My name is Kimball Siquaptiwa. You can call me Kimball. From the Hopi tribe and a mother of 3 in the Pueblo of Cochiti. Please note that while I share a tribal experience, it's largely a rural experience. It is well known that New Mexico is one of the least connected states in the country, in large part due to the rugged and rocky terrain and sparse population density. In my community, the wireline ISP offerings have not changed in 20 years. In short, there are none. Until I completed my first fiber optic network in 2018, the entire tribal government and public library shared a 3.0 megabit per second connection over a bonded T1. As the Chief Technology Director for the Santa Fe Indian School, it was my duty to provide internet connectivity to our 700 students who, during COVID-19, we sent home to 23 rural tribal communities, some of the least connected lands in the United States. In fact, 89% of our students did not have internet access that met the FCC performance benchmark of 25.3. Those that did lived in town. If there was a silver lining, it was that we could build on previous efforts. In 2016, I leveraged the FCC Schools and Libraries E-rate program to create a consortia of tribal schools and libraries to bring high-speed internet to 6 pueblos. Our goal was to provide our Pueblo students with the same college and career opportunities as their more affluent peers. Realizing that our work reached beyond education, the tribe self-invested in additional infrastructure for improved governance and focused efforts such as healthcare. With their new fiber backhaul, it was these tribes who were able to pivot and deploy residential internet access during the pandemic. Some now participate in the Affordable Connectivity Program as service providers. Fast forward to 2022, the work continues. Thanks to the NTIA Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program, the Santa Fe Indian School is constructing a 324-mile route to 3 more pueblos and remote tribal lands. TBCP springboards tribal efforts to connect unserved homes and anchor institutions, and our experience has proven that we can be our own solution to the digital divide. It is also true that until the iterative FCC broadband fabric matures, tribal self-certification of broadband availability is essential. In my rural community, the map currently shows 3 residences when it should show 275. In total, the Santa Fe Indian School will have placed 500 miles of middle mile fiber, which is equally important for the state of New Mexico as it is for the tribes. Given the NTIA open network requirement, private industry will not have to bear those expensive costs to build these routes, and will have access to fiber backhaul to improve and extend their last mile networks. For too long, providers have built around sovereign lands when in fact we are the critical partners to achieve right-of-way and navigate permitting processes along with the federal agencies having oversight. As chair of the Connect New Mexico Council, and with my colleagues, we steward the deployment of scalable, reliable, affordable broadband to connect every New Mexican, utilizing both state funds and the upcoming IIGA BEAD program. In addition, in New Mexico, we created a pilot grant with BEAD-like NOFO requirements, and I can see formidable barriers to participation. While local governments and tribes are eligible as BEAD grantees, functionally, the stringent requirements for matching funds, letters of credit, and professional engineering stamps discourage participation. These requirements favor better resource ISPs who will apply to serve their next best markets. As a nation, we run the risk of maintaining the status quo and missing the most underserved communities without local flexibility to administer federally funded programs. The rush to use the FCC fabric map compounds the issue. We estimate that the fabric is missing tens of thousands of unserved homes and anchor institutions, such as small schools, healthcare centers, houses of worship in New Mexico, potentially shortchanging our state by up to $500 million in funding. An educated guess, because the way the funding formula will work is still unknown. We ask NTIA to extend the January 13th, 2023 deadline to have more time to challenge the missing location to the FCC's preliminary broadband map. Lastly, I submit that the solution to bridge the digital divide in the United States does not lie in a methodology limited to a conventional ISP approach. In that, I refer to a broader broadband ecosystem. For instance, only half of the states in the country have state education networks, an approach that is not currently incentivized. The development of state education networks has the ancillary benefit of installing middle-mile infrastructure, enabling last-mile deployments. The way that the fabric currently counts anchor institutions minimizes the role that they can play to provide systemic solutions. Uplifting these corollary broadband efforts creates a holistic approach, one that is needed to solve the complexity of broadband access for all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Next, we'll hear from the Honorable Michael Powell, the President and CEO of NCTA.
Thank you very much, Chair Luján, Ranking Member Thune, members of the committee. I'm honored to be with you today. I'm Michael Powell, President and CEO of NCTA, the Internet and Television Association. And our members have invested hundreds of billions of dollars over 20 years to bring high-speed, high-quality broadband to 90% of households. And while we're proud of that achievement, we recognize that the work is undone. Many of our members would love to serve rural and unserved parts of the country, but are unable to do so because they're cost prohibitive without public support. For that reason, we're extremely excited, motivated, and committed to work with Congress and community organizations to make this last great opportunity a resounding success over the next couple of years. It's not an exaggeration to say this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity for three reasons. First is the amount of money appropriated is genuinely unprecedented. It is 10 times the amount of money that was allocated and authorized during the BTOP program in 2009. And it really addresses the core concern in many unserved areas. Simply put, it's too costless to serve with too little revenue to continue to operate the network without a loss. This scale of resources provides the first meaningful opportunity to genuinely close the digital divide. And so we're very excited about that. The second area that really represents true wisdom on the part of this committee in Congress is to insist that the FCC develop more granular broadband maps. For too long, we have used maps that are out of date, well understood to have overstated the number of areas that are unserved. That's a serious problem in targeting resources in an efficient and significant way. We're very excited about that. The FCC has made a gallant effort at the first draft. I think it's commendable. It's a very difficult task, but there are many, many rounds of improving the data quality to ensure that those maps are accurate in the ways that Chair Luján was referencing. Thirdly, and I think less discussed, is that Congress took a fresh approach to addressing adoption and affordability. Fresh in that it focused on direct credits to consumers in order to afford high-quality service. Put simply, combined with the kinds of offerings ISPs have agreed to provide, eligible low-income families will be able to access broadband essentially for free. And just as importantly, have the freedom to choose the plans that most suit their family needs. This is a great improvement. But we know from past experience, it's going to take a lot more than money. It's going to take excellent execution of the program. As Senator Thune mentioned, these are 130 programs with a lot of money being funneled through 15 different agencies. Gosh, what could go wrong? In our past experience, we have lessons that tell us what will go wrong, and I'd like to highlight just a few. The first is failing to maintain discipline in targeting the most unserved areas. I follow the family dinner rule. Nobody should get seconds till everybody's been served. Frequently in past programs, this is the biggest error that's repeatedly made. Money will always work hard to get to more economic communities if allowed to, in areas where there's already broadband and where the economics are more sound. It'll require discipline on the part of regulators to ensure that that doesn't happen. The second important thing to do is remove obstacles the federal government and other government agencies have within their power. Here I speak specifically of permitting, both on federal lands and in local communities, as well as access to poles. Put directly, poles are the lifeline to reach rural America. If you do not have access to them at reasonable rates, you will not reach those communities, plain and simple. Next is the importance of maintaining discipline against regulatory creep. These kinds of programs always have a tendency to attract layered on regulatory requirements that are tangential to the mission of the program. The consequence of that is it creates more complexity, additional burden, and raises the cost of an already fragile cost model. We should resist the temptation to do that as much as conceivably possible. And finally, we have experienced all too often the presence of waste, fraud, and abuse. While we see a set of taxpayer resources to solve an important public policy problem, there will be people who see it as a honeypot and will endeavor to find every scheme possible to take as much of that money as they can. We've seen that before. That requires real accountability, real transparency, clear criteria, a government that explains its decisions in issuing grants clearly and make them publicly available. So thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Next, we'll hear from Mr. Jonathan Spalter, the President and CEO of U.S. Telecom.
Good morning, Chair Luján and Ranking Member Thune. I'm so glad for the invitation to join this conversation today, and I'd like to join you, Senator Luján, in extending thanks to Senator Wicker for his exceptional service to this committee, but also to the cause of broadband around the country. My name is Jonathan Spalter. As you mentioned, I'm the President and CEO of U.S. Telecom, the Broadband Association. We're the National Trade Association representing network providers, innovators, and suppliers and manufacturers connecting the world through the power of broadband. Our membership ranges from leading publicly traded companies, some of the largest investors and job creators in the country, to local and regional companies and cooperatives that have roots in their states and in their service areas going back over a century. What unites our diverse membership is a shared commitment to connecting communities, businesses and individuals to opportunity, to a better quality of life, and to each other via technology. U.S. broadband, I believe in my heart, has been a tremendous national success story with massive investment in network expansions, prices that are actually trending lower, even in a time of inflation, and ever-increasing speeds. And as Senator Thune has mentioned, broadband providers' investments, along with smart, common sense regulatory and legislative approaches, is why America's networks rose to the challenge of the pandemic despite surges in demand due to the abrupt shift to work, school, healthcare, and everything else from the home. The pandemic, however, also lays quite bare the unacceptable cost of being left on the wrong side of the digital divide. Universal connectivity is a matter of digital equity, and our collective work is not yet done. But working together, I believe in my core that it is in reach. Between the tens of billions of dollars our members invest each year in connected infrastructure and the federal investments included in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, we have the opportunity to finally, fully, and forever connect all parts of our nation if we all work together to meet this historic moment. So, I appreciate the opportunity to roll up our sleeves and explore the underlying causes of the remaining broadband gaps and some of the concrete steps that we collectively can take to close them. This includes maximizing the IIJA opportunity by ensuring that funding recipients have the technical, operational, and financial wherewithal to get these essential infrastructure projects over the finish line. Removing or lowering hurdles to speedy deployment, clarifying that broadband grants should not be treated as taxable income, making permanent the Affordable Connectivity Program to help low-income families pay for internet service, charting a sustainable future, a resilient future for universal service, and last but not least, ensuring that everyone has the digital skills that are necessary to harness all that broadband makes possible to all in our country. We must not oversimplify the complexities of achieving affordable, reliable, high-speed internet for all, and you'll find no more committed partner and ally to making this happen than America's broadband providers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Spalter. Next, we are going to hear from Angela Seifer, the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance.
Thank you so much for having me here. It's a privilege and a joy to talk to you today. I'm Angela Seifer. I'm the Executive Director of the National Digital Inclusion Alliance. We're a nonprofit that advances digital equity by supporting community programs and equipping policymakers to act, which is what we did. We envision a country where everyone has the opportunity to use technology to live, learn, work, and thrive. Digital inequities are not new, but the pandemic made them painfully clear. That clarity caused action. Hurrah! Right? Communities came together, scaled up existing digital inclusion programs, set up new programs, took risks on innovative solutions. They are our country's digital equity heroes. They would not have made such progress without the swift actions of Congress during the pandemic. Representing the digital equity community, I thank you. NDIA sits in a unique position. We facilitate the nation's largest community of practice. We have over 1,000 organizations of local experts, relaying their lessons learned and community needs to policymakers. These heroes need you, again. The historic investment in digital equity is amazing, but it will not fully bridge the digital divide. As long as technology keeps changing, the work will keep changing. The divide will keep changing. There are many solutions: affordable, robust broadband, affordable devices that meet the needs of the user, access to ongoing skills training, and tech support in multiple languages. What your historic investment should do, let's say will do, is change systems, so that we have strong digital inclusion ecosystems that allow us to continually adapt to technology changes. Let's call the investments a success when 4 things happen. Government agencies integrate broadband adoption programming and device ownership into their programs. Industries who benefit from customers being online prioritize corporate giving and community partnerships. Philanthropy prioritizes digital equity in their giving because it strengthens their missions. 4th, local digital inclusion ecosystems are so robust that when people can't get online for any reason, they readily find the support and resources they need. That would all be success. If all that happens, it's awesome, but we still need federal support. Long-term solutions to bridging the digital divide require all hands on deck. As of December 15th, 15 million households were enrolled in the Affordable Connectivity Program. Given that the rules for that were just created, this is a monumental feat. We're thrilled that the FCC will soon have outreach funds going into trusted community-based organizations who are already investing their own resources and raising awareness and deploying digital navigators to sit with their neighbors. But unless Congress takes action, this vital program will go away in just a few short years. Internet service providers' low-cost programs are helpful, but they have participation limitations. Representing the digital equity community today, I ask you for sustained funding for the Affordable Connectivity Program. As we build networks and address broadband adoption through BEAD, we also need sustained federal funding for all the solutions, holistic solutions. Digital navigators, digital skills training, devices, not just for students. Representing the digital equity community, I ask you to make the Digital Equity Foundation a reality. Funded by Spectrum Auctions, this will provide long-term support mechanism for digital inclusion programs. Another request, we sorely need a full FCC. They have a big job. Consider the new maps, the broadband consumer labels, ACP, ECF, many other responsibilities. They cannot do this without Gigi Sohn. Representing the digital equity community, I urge the Senate to confirm her nomination before the holiday recess. Finally, we need to increase the amount of digital equity funds dedicated to tribes and territories. The needs in Indian country and in the territories are great, and there are simply not enough funds in the Digital Equity Act to fully cover these needs. I know I'm asking for a lot. It's bad form. Say thank you and ask for more. But here it is. That's our needs. Internet access and the skills to use it are not only essential to survive, but to thrive. And thriving is essential to America's promise, to the well-being of its people, and the country's ability to compete globally. Thank you for having me, and I welcome the committee's comments and questions.
Thank you, Ms. Seifer. I'll now recognize members for questions, and I'll start with myself. The first question that I have is to all of the panel, and it's a simple yes or no question. Does increased broadband adoption act as a multiplier for other sectors including healthcare, education, employment, and commerce. Kimball?
Chair, absolutely. It has the ability to uplift community well-being across those sectors. And the internet, has been in our tribal communities for a long time on our cell phones, but community use, government using broadband to make our community stronger with improved healthcare and education is what broadband is about for our work.
I appreciate that. That's a resounding yes. I appreciate that. Mr. Powell?
Also resounding yes. I chair the board of the Mayo Clinic, and I can tell you the importance of telehealth in the case of a national emergency was essential.
Thank you. Mr. Spalter?
Well, absolutely, yes. And just why we really do thank you for your leadership on moving forward on IIJA and working with our companies to ensure that all Americans can in fact be connected.
Appreciate that, Ms. Seifer.
Resounding yes.
Appreciate that. Another yes or no question. Do federal subsidies like the Affordable Connectivity Program, which provides $30 a month stipend toward internet service for eligible households and $75 a month for households on tribal lands, lower barriers to broadband access? Kimball?
Absolutely. It's a critical stopgap measure. It was a critical response during the pandemic, and it's a critical stopgap measure moving forward while we install affordable high-speed networks to put in permanent solutions in our communities.
Appreciate that, Mr. Powell.
Yes, I think so. Providing a free service removes price as any barrier to adoption, so it's critical.
Yes, I think so. Okay, I may come back to that a little bit later. Mr. Spalter?
Absolutely, yes. While, in fact, in context, while overall inflation has increased, broadband prices have actually bucked this trend. The average consumer spends $45 a month on broadband, which is actually 14% less between 2021 and 2022. I'd also say that it is incredibly important, and I agree with Ms. Seifer, that we have to sustain the Affordable Connectivity Program and make it permanent.
So the importance of sustaining the programs. I may follow up there as well. And then Ms. Seifer, to that previous question.
Resounding yes.
Another yes or no, do digital equity initiatives like those funded by the Digital Equity Act for digital literacy lower barriers to broadband adoption? Ms. Kimball?
Absolutely. We're not putting in broadband just for the sake of the broadband. We're trying to change human lives and have people utilize the technology. So digital broadband adoption is the humanistic side of this technology infrastructure project.
Appreciate that, Mr. Powell.
Yes, we've learned from past experiences that outreach, awareness, digital literacy, community groups are essential to success.
Appreciate that, sir. Mr. Spalter?
Yes.
Ms. Seifer?
Yes, of course.
I'm glad I could hear you, Mr. Spalter. Now, there should be little debate on this. Deployment, affordability, and adoption, each one provides a piece of the puzzle. So I appreciate the explanation and the responses. Now, the Affordable Connectivity Program has made a real difference helping Americans afford broadband access, but the funding won't last forever. Hence, the importance of this being a sustainable program. And the Digital Equity Act will help fund initiatives that target other barriers to broadband adoption across the country. But it's not a permanent program, and we need to do more. Ms. Seifer, in addition to encouraging build-out, how can Congress work to provide permanent solutions to barriers to broadband adoption in the United States?
There's the individual things that members of Congress can do, which is working with those industries that are impacted, right? If the industry has benefits from having folks being online, this is all the industries, right? This isn't just internet service providers, but working with them to help them understand the benefit so that they are then part of the solution. Then it's also the Affordable Connectivity Program, it's the Digital Equity Foundation, it's all the things that you all know you've already done before, but because the digital divide is not going to be over, we have to keep doing those things.
And Mr. Spalter, yes or no, do you believe all broadband access technologies, whether it be fiber, cable, wireless, satellite, provide equal access to learning tools?
Yes, I do. I would argue, however, that it is wired-based infrastructure that is going to be actually able to allow us to achieve our goal of a fully and finally connected nation, and we should focus our resources and our funding programs accordingly.
And Mr. Spalter, yes or no, do some of your members maintain data caps or data throttling on their consumer broadband offerings?
these are certain of our members actually do provide a range of different options to their consumers, including lower priced options that would include a data cap. This is an option that is potentially very accessible to and important to certain of our consumers, and particularly, for example, seniors who might want to choose a lower price option.
I appreciate that, and my time is up. Mr. Powell, I have the same question for you, so if time allows later, I'll come back and ask a similar question as well. I'll now recognize Mr. Thune for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start by saying I have concerns about, as I said earlier, NTIA and other agencies pursuing extraneous political goals in their respective broadband programs, which could ultimately lead to increased costs for providers deploying networks. Mr. Powell, in your testimony, you talked about the need for, or of government agencies, I should say, to avoid unnecessary added costs. Could you elaborate on this? How does direct and indirect forms of net neutrality, open access, burdensome labor requirements affect the deployment of broadband networks to truly unserved areas?
Yeah, I start with the premise that, remember, the problem we're trying to solve is really precarious economic environments that have disincented providers from serving those areas. So we have to be highly sensitive to what additional costs we're adding. So frequently these programs add levels of cost that compromise the model for whether to accept funds to enter a market or not. For example, if you don't have clarity on what rates you're allowed to charge and there are suggestions you will regulate the rates, that's a disincentive to knowing whether you can afford to offer the service because you're not clear on the amount of revenue you get. Another example might be extensive workforce regulations, while well-intended, ultimately mean you've reduced the pool of skilled workers available to provider in order to meet the build-out requirements in a market with tight labor. That's very, very complicating and actually could frustrate or defeat any number of initiatives. Failure to be tech neutral could mean you have a limited amount of tools in your toolbox to solve complex problems in rural America, and thus, you again might choose to pass on participation in the program. So you could go on ways that these things manifest themselves in actual decisions on the ground.
Mr. Spalter and Mr. Powell, there are a number of barriers that slow down the deployment of networks. Could you discuss the barriers your members face today and whether or not Congress should take additional action on federal permitting reforms?
Certainly. Yes, Senator, there are a number of different barriers that slow down deployment, including, as you mentioned, a range of permitting challenges that our members face both federally and also at the state and local level. We believe that there needs to be more coordinated and accountable efforts on the part of the 13 various agencies that are involved in deploying broadband around our country. We believe that there should be much greater coordination as well with state and local authorities to ensure that permitting barriers can actually be leveled and we can machete through a lot of these problems. I've been hearing from some of our members, for example, in western Montana, where the permitting challenges on BLM lands can add 3 years to a build-out. These are incredibly challenging situations, and we have to collectively work together to address them.
You testified before the Commerce Committee in May 2020 on the resiliency of our country's broadband network during the COVID pandemic. The United States, as has been pointed out, fared much better than European countries because of our light touch approach to regulating broadband networks. Now that we're almost 2 years removed from the height of the COVID pandemic, what lessons should policymakers take away from future attempts to regulate broadband, and what policies can Congress pursue in the next Congress to encourage continued investments?
I think that the pandemic was instrumental in showing all Americans, and I hopefully as well our policymakers and regulators, that the kinds of common sense, smart policy frameworks that enabled innovation and investment to the levels that we've seen. And I would like to point out a high watermark just last year of $86 billion in capital investment in our networks were made possible not because we were trying to slow down incentives for investment innovation, but because we were trying to actually accelerate them. I think going forward, if we can actually collectively as a nation make sure that, especially on the precipice of this historic moment where we actually will be able to deliver the $42.5 billion of BEAD program money, that we not encumber this new tranche of investment in unnecessary regulatory overhang, and that the NTIA and the states scrupulously listened to the intent of Congress as it was expressed in the IIJA, that let's focus on getting the monies out to the underserved and unserved first.
As I mentioned in my opening statement, there are 130 programs, stunning, really, supporting broadband across 15 different agencies. Could you speak to the frustrations that your members have when they're notified after the fact that another federal agency is providing funding to another entity to provide broadband in an area that's already served? And I would start with Mr. Powell, Mr. Spalter, and then open it up to the panel.
To quote one of my CEOs, it's a lot of money going to too many places through too many programs under different criteria. This is very, very complex to manage. I think that you know, another thing that our members are quite frustrated by is areas that are possibly unserved, but there's already been federal commitments to serve those areas that have been provided through other programs. So, for example, you could have won money in RDOF to serve an area, yet it shows up as unserved in FCC maps, or programs don't fully recognize existing commitments to serve areas. That can lead to a lot of confusion, complexity, and stranded investment, because they bid on those projects on the assumption that they would build in those spaces under these terms and criteria, only to have another program parachute in on the same thing. So one of the challenges for regulators is to ruthlessly attempt to harmonize criteria, conditions across these programs and make sure all take cognizance of the other as they make their decisions.
Frustrated is one word I would use. I think that there are some others in my thesaurus that I could also throw out. But clearly, our members who know the implicit and high fixed costs of deploying networks are alarmed when they are potentially overbuilt by federal dollars from one agency coming in and actually making it more challenging for them to deploy, which is one of the reasons why we believe firmly, Senator, that there should be, that Congress should require a certification process by which agencies certify that their use of federal funds would not be actually deployed in areas where federal funds are already being spent.
For all the panelists, yes or no questions, Congress need to consider creating any new broadband programs, yes or no?
Should they consider new broadband programs? I think we have a lot of broadband programs. I think they should focus on refining and get the most out of the ones that we have at the moment.
Agree. I think that let's see how the BEAD program progresses. Let's see what we can do about reforming USF, and then we consider whether or not additional programs need to come online.
Sifa?
So I would focus on the broadband adoption side of it and further invest in what we have.
Ms. Kimball?
I'd allow for continued funding to focus on time, on budget implementations with the adequate support to realize those goals.
Yeah, and I'll just close, Mr. Chairman, by saying, and I for one am concerned that any new programs are going to lead to duplication of services and wasteful spending, and I hope that this vast array of programs that we have and the funding that's associated with that can be put on the target, and that we don't end up with a lot of overbuilding and wasteful funding that doesn't achieve the desired goal. It seems to me there is a ton of funding in the pipeline right now. And you add that to the normal, as I said earlier, USF funding. We are in a unique position, and hopefully it can be utilized in a way that, utilized wisely and well on behalf of the taxpayers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thune. Mr. Peters, you're recognized for your question, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Spalter, thank you for being here today. As you know, in 2020, Congress passed the Secure and Trusted Communications Act to ensure that American broadband networks were free from the influence of Chinese state-connected companies like Huawei. In the bill, we promised the broadband providers that we would help pay for, quote, rip and replace this equipment. But so far, Congress hasn't kept up with that promise, and there's roughly $3 billion shortfall in the program. And what some people, I think, don't realize is that this funding shortfall isn't just a national security issue, it's also a broadband equity issue as well. For example, in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, where 25% of households cannot access broadband currently, Northern Michigan University operates a network that provides connectivity to its student body and over 16,000 households in roughly 120 rural Michigan communities. And without funding from Congress to replace its Huawei equipment with trusted technology, the university's ability to provide this service is without question in danger right now. So my question for you is, can you explain the potential consequences that rural broadband providers and rural users that rely on that service are going to face if Congress does not act soon to fully fund RIP and replace?
Let me start by thanking you, Senator, for your consistent and forceful stewardship of our nation's the security and resiliency of our cyber infrastructure. That's very, very appreciated by all in our sector. If rural and local providers, particularly like those in Northern Michigan, are unable to access RIP and replace funds, they will not be eligible to access universal service funds. And that can have a devastating consequence on the lives of our rural communities, the families and the enterprises that populate them. This is an absolutely challenging issue that we have to make sure that those $3 billion can actually be deployed and make sure that none of our rural and local providers will be denied access to the types of support that they need, either in terms of CapEx or OpEx, to deploy and maintain and manage their networks.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the answer. I think it's important for people to realize the implication of this. And Mr. Chair, I would also like to enter into the hearing record a letter from 7 broadband trade associations in support of funding RIP and replace. Thank you. Ms. Seifer, I want to first thank you for highlighting the great work of digital navigators such as Detroit's Connect 313 that are able to help guide communities through the Affordable Connectivity Program. Connect 313 is part of the reason that Detroit has the highest rate of enrollment in the Affordable Connectivity Program of any other metro area in the nation, with 61% of eligible households. And overall, Michigan's enrollment rate in ACP is almost 44%. These high rates of enrollment are due to the tireless efforts of our state agencies and local organizations like Connect 313 to help eligible households navigate the process. But there's certainly much more that we need to do. And so my question for you is, can you expand on some of the things organizations like Connect 313 are doing right to increase enrollment in ACP? And how can Congress better help their efforts to continue this very important work?
Yes, that's a fabulous question. So organizations like Connect 313, they work with those who are in the community who are already trusted for some other reason. So it could be food banks, it could be community action agencies, libraries, schools, but those who already have relationships with those who are in need of that subsidy. And because they have those relationships, that's how they get those high numbers. We need more of that across the country, right? We shouldn't just be in Detroit where we're seeing such high numbers. But that requires investment in those digital navigation services. We also need education of internet service providers, customer service agents. Sometimes there's confusion because this is all confusing. ACP, low-cost offers, it's all awesome and it's all new and it is confusing, so we need increased education of those folks. And we need more database connections so that when folks are signing up, it's more automatic. Right now, sometimes folks have to go through a long process.
Right, thank you. And Mr. Powell, quickly, I'm running out of time, but ACTA represents Charter and Comcast, which are 2 major providers in Michigan. Can you speak to the extent that they and other providers have and will take steps to improve outreach and implementation of the Affordable Connectivity Program?
Yes, sir. The good benefit of those 2 programs and many others of our members is they've been doing low-cost programs, private programs for over a decade, and they have an enormous amount of experience with what works. They know that outreach is essential. Having digital navigators that help people through the process is essential. Making sure people understand the terms of the program is essential. So they have deep-rooted expertise and teams dedicated to those extra efforts, and they work with groups like those represented today to try to make that effective.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Senator Blackburn, you're recognized for your questions. 1 second, Senator Blackburn. We can't hear her, and on her end, it's unmuted. Would you try speaking again, Senator Blackburn? Let's see if we can fix that audio.
Yes, absolutely. Are you hearing me now?
We can hear you, Senator. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. And I do thank you for the hearing. As you all know, and with our witnesses, you all have heard from us for years on this issue of deployment. And Mr. Powell, I want to come to you first. When you look at all the money that has gone out through the infrastructure bill, through CARES, through the American Rescue Plan, all of this money that is out there for broadband, and you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. And then in Tennessee, our state General Assembly put another $100 million in behind grants for broadband. So it seems like the funds are there, but yet we continue to hear these low population areas, they're having trouble getting people to come in and do that last mile to reach these homes where there is less population per mile. So I'd like for you to just help me to look at this. What else do you need when it comes to connecting these areas, and why is the hesitation there when there seems to be so much money there? What are we missing on this?
Yeah, Senator, thank you for the question. Obviously, money is critical because these are very cost-prohibitive areas, but it's not in and of itself enough. One of the problems we run into, we've discussed with others today, is the complexity of permitting in these parts of the country. A lot of these examples include crossing federal lands. Very often, more than one federal agency will claim the authority for issuing those permits. There's no lead entity that a carrier can go to resolve those conflicts. Those fees, those permits often require very exorbitant access fees that vary from one federal program to the other. Not that we don't hack our way through this process, but it literally can add years and years to a commitment to build.
Yeah. It is a frustration to many of our county mayors who are trying to get this done. And I visit with all 95 of our county mayors in Tennessee every year. Mr. Spalter, weigh in on the same question, if you will, please.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to answer that question, Senator. No, I agree with Mr. Powell that the challenges that are that come with onerous, slow, and absolutely cumbersome permitting challenges are manifold, and we need to address them square on if we are going to be able to provide access to often our hardest to reach rural and unserved and underserved communities. It is incumbent on us as an industry to continue to put our shoulder towards this problem, but we're not going to be able to solve it alone. We have to be able to work with this body, with the federal government, and also with state and localities to ensure that there's going to be a greater consensus of making broadband service more accessible and more efficiently, more quickly, by lowering the barriers that come with permitting challenges.
All right, let me ask you this. Talking about barriers, when Alan Davidson was before us, I had asked him about some of the labor laws and practices, and if they were going to require areas to implement those when it's a state like Tennessee that's a right-to-work state. That is one of those barriers. So how do you see that playing out?
Let me take a stab at that if I can, Senator, and it's a very important question. I'll start by saying that some of our providers are amongst the largest employers of labor in the United States of America. That said, the IIJA recognizes that broadband funding programs should not be subject to Davis-Bacon regulations. We believe that NTIA should scrupulously follow the intent and spirit of the law without any hesitation. And this applies not only to Davis-Bacon, but also to the middle-class subsidy requirement that has been advanced by NTIA, I think outside of the spirit of the IIG.
Mr. Powell, anything to add to that?
No, I think Mr. Spalter categorized right. It isn't a war between whether, good employee protections or not are valuable. It's the amount of skilled labor available. By our measures, even before this program, there was a need for some 850,000 new skilled workers in this space. These additional requirements only complicate that pool.
Okay, and I know Senator Thune asked you all about the 100 programs over 15 agencies, which is an area of concern for us. You kind of batted around a little bit on that. So I would like a written response from you all, Mr. Spalter and Mr. Powell, to talk a little bit about what you see as a way to do some streamlining to speed up this broadband deployment and get to the heart of connectivity. So if you would do that and submit it for the record, that would be excellent. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Certainly.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Next, we will hear from Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. Just yesterday, the Minnesota Department of Employment and Economic Development received nearly $6 million in federal funds for broadband. We are very excited about this. We have about 144,000 Minnesotans that don't have high speed, and we will personally thank the chair for that money. Thank you, Mr. Chair, as well as all the people that have worked on this. And it's been a high priority of mine since I've gotten here, because I just view it as the way that we're going to make it, especially in rural America, easier for people to continue to live there. And that was very clear through the pandemic. We do have workforce issues. My state has the lowest unemployment rate in the country. About 2 months ago, we had the lowest unemployment rate in the country in the history of America. That's a true story. And now we're at like 2% or something. So, Mr. Spalter, you mentioned in your written testimony the availability of skilled labor is one of the challenges in deploying next generation networks. Can you tell us about what you're seeing on the ground? I'm a big believer in immigration reform, as are many in this committee, and I think it would be a game changer for us for deploying some of the technology we need to deploy. Go ahead.
Sure, and thanks for the question, Senator. It is true that many of our providers are facing real shortfalls in accessing skilled labor to do the important work of broadband deployment, be it digging trenches, pulling fiber, managing the various technical and service requirements that are part of the process of delivering broadband, which is why we've been working hand in glove with community colleges, high schools, a variety of community organizations to develop apprentice programs, training programs. I think of, for example, one of our members, Hunter Communications in Northern California, has engaged a partnership with the Hoopa Valley Reservation to do apprentice training. This is just one of hundreds of examples of where we've been trying to support the workforce pipeline.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Ms. Seifer, I'm chair of the Antitrust Subcommittee, and I'm always interested in the role competition can play in making high-speed broadband more affordable. One of the issues in certain areas of our state, there's only one provider, and I know one of the things we did with this bill was to direct the FCC to require providers to show essential pricing and speed information in a simple format, so consumers can make more informed decision, but even that doesn't help the 87 million Americans that have only one choice. I've got a bunch of rural electric co-ops that have gotten in the game and have been very responsive when they have. Also, smaller phone companies have tended to build out more, and I love the fact that we have a clawback in the law, and I've talked to Secretary Raimondo if the money goes out and the broadband isn't built. So could you talk about what could be done to increase competition in our broadband markets?
The competition piece is important in terms of lowering the cost for consumers, but it will only lower it to where it's affordable for middle class. The lower income folks are still going to need that subsidy. So we still have to go it as a two-part, yes, increased subsidy.
That doesn't change that.
Yes,
right?
exactly. So
I'm more interested in the providers and how we can do that.
So that we need as many options on the table as possible. So don't restrict local folks' ability to create solutions.
Very good. Mr. Paul, can you tell us of ways we can improve coordination and administration of the funding programs for broadband across government agencies, given your experience from the past?
Well, I think Congress was smart to require the FCC and the NTI and others to go through a process of developing an MOU for greater coordination. But, you know, having a meeting is not the same as coordination. I think one way that would improve that is really create a set of external criteria that would allow you to measure whether that coordination and harmonization is effective, as opposed to just being able to meet the requirement by saying, yeah, we talked 3 or 4 times. It's going to take a lot more than that.
Very good. Yes, I think that's going to be very important. I think also the people involved in it, the agency heads, who I have respect for, is key as well. Ms. Kwaptia, thank you so much for being here. Could you talk about how communities are using federal funding to provide devices, which is part of getting at low-income households, and are there ways we can assure these funds are used more efficiently?
Sure, the tribal libraries in our communities play a critical role for internet access historically, but also access to devices. So the participation of these entities in the digital equity planning, as well as the schools with the Emergency Connectivity Fund, are critical to providing devices for the students and community members.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Next, we will hear from Senator Sinema, and this will be audio.
Thank you, Chairman Luján, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, passing last year's bipartisan infrastructure law was a watershed moment for broadband connectivity across the United States. I was proud to help lead the effort to bring the infrastructure law together, building on and incorporating ideas from many of my colleagues on this committee from both sides of the aisle. The bipartisan infrastructure law's historic investments in deployment, affordability, tribal access, and digital inclusion are the first steps towards ensuring all Arizonans will have high-speed broadband. But passing the law isn't enough. Congress and stakeholders across the country, like our witnesses today, must ensure the programs are implemented effectively, funding is distributed quickly, and approvals are processed appropriately to ensure that we close the digital divide. My first question today is for Mr. Spalter. One area of improvement is with permit approvals by federal agencies. This is an area of particular interest for large western states like Arizona, where the federal government owns 42% of the land in our state. I recognize Chair Luján's interest in this as well, as he represents our neighbor, New Mexico. Currently, permit approvals by the federal government, such as the Bureau of Land Management or the National Forest Service, can take years. This needs to be improved. So, Mr. Spalter, have your members experienced challenges with securing federal government approvals, and do you have any recommendations to streamline the process?
Thank you for the question, Senator. We are frequently experiencing sometimes very severe permitting challenges and delays in deploying. These are expressed not only for our largest providers, but also and critically for our regional and local providers as well. The good news is that there have been steps that have been advanced to actually address some of these issues, and I just point to one, for example. Under BEAD, states must share their plans to streamline their permitting and rights-of-way processes. This is going to be at least one way to standardize permitting approaches on a national and harmonized basis, and we hope that this will take root and also just raise the visibility on the need to actually address permitting challenges fully and finally.
Well, thank you. My next question is for Ms. Kimball Sikwapatiwa. I hope I said that right. Sikwapatiwa.
Excellent.
Was it really? Well.
Good work. Very brave as well.
In the bipartisan infrastructure law, Congress allocated $2 billion specifically for the tribal broadband connectivity program, in addition to tribal broadband funding from previous laws. Now, some of this funding has already gone out to tribes. For example, the Gila River Indian community will use a $4.4 million grant to assist in telehealth expansion, distance learning opportunities, affordable broadband service, and economic growth. The Hopi tribe will use a $13.8 million grant to install fiber connecting over 1,000 unserved Native American households, plus 18 businesses and 6 community anchor institutions. My question for you is, based on your experience at the Santa Fe Indian School and as chair of the Connect New Mexico Council, Could you discuss the importance of the tribal broadband connectivity program for tribes in the Southwest? And could you recommend any additional steps Congress should take to help ensure more tribal communities have fast, affordable broadband access?
Yes, thank you for that question. I believe that this tribal broadband connectivity program is historic, it's monumental, and it's allowing us tribes to work towards building our own community solutions. While $2 billion is a lot of funding, it is not going to meet all of the needs in our rural tribal communities. In the Southwest, there's been a number of middle mile projects as well as last mile projects that work together in unison. For instance, my project at the Santa Fe Indian School is putting in the middle mile, but we work closely with our sovereign nation consortia partners who have been applicants as well for fiber to the home or fixed wireless solutions. Together, as we built a cohort and share expertise, navigate the permitting processes, share technical expertise, and centralize services for improved gateway services such as cybersecurity, we're able to build an ecosystem that serves not just our last mile tribal needs, but our regional needs as well.
Well, thank you. My last question is for Mr. Powell. Mr. Powell, with the FCC publication of its pre-production draft of new nationwide broadband maps, these draft maps will enable the state of Arizona, as well as our tribal and local governments and other stakeholders, to provide feedback on the FCC's analysis. These maps will enable the FCC to work with the NTIA to begin the process of distributing broadband funding appropriate in the bipartisan infrastructure law to state governments. Now, Mr. Powell, these FCC maps are just the first drafts. As these maps continue to be improved, do you have any recommendations for how to best ensure the maps are used to direct federal money to unserved and underserved locations consistent with the requirements of the law?
Yeah, suggestion one is we have to make sure we have a very robust amount of feedback to the quality of the maps to get them improved, particularly the January 13th deadline, which is what NTIA has said is necessary as a predicate to distributing the funding in June. I think the second problem I see is, the map is not universally applicable. We have other large federal programs that are not required to use the map. I think that's potentially problematic. And I think we have a lot of states that will have different versions of the map. We would hope that those get fed into the FCC process, and the FCC process continues to develop a genuinely authoritative map that all of the communities can rely on equally.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Next, we'll hear from Senator Baldwin for her questions, and then we'll go to Senator Young. Senator Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me start with you, Ms. Seifer. The Affordable Connectivity Program is responsible for connecting almost 250,000 Wisconsin households to affordable high-speed broadband. And I'm proud to have voted for the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which made that possible. Governor Evers and the Wisconsin Public Service Commission have done a laudable job of encouraging Wisconsinites to apply for this benefit. But I was really concerned to learn of a recent study finding that 45% of affordable connectivity program applications to the program are rejected. That is a very staggering figure. And so I'm asking you what more can be done at the federal, state, and local levels to make applying easier for eligible families and to encourage more seamless eligibility verification.
It's a really great question. The computer matching agreements that state programs have with USAC, we don't have it for all the programs, we don't have it with all the states, so that would speed things up quite a bit, because then there wouldn't be this paperwork, oh, you didn't give us the right PDF or whatever, right? That happens. But also the human aspect of this, having more funding for digital navigators. So there's someone sitting next to the person signing up and saying, oh, I'm sorry, because of your situation, we need you to submit this instead of this, because it is confusing. And so if you don't have that human helping you, you can think you've submitted everything and you didn't.
Okay. Mr. Spalter, Wisconsin residents depend on services made possible by the Universal Service Fund, including rural broadband through the Connect America Fund, Lifeline phone services, and E-rate funding for school and library connectivity. The Fifth Circuit recently heard arguments on whether this fund, which has been supported on a bipartisan basis for decades, is unconstitutional. what would be the impact to the telecommunications ecosystem if the Universal Service Fund was ruled unconstitutional?
Senator, it would be nothing less than a force majeure that would impact our nation's commitment to the future of universal connectivity. We believe in the constitutionality of the program. We believe that it is on sound legal footing, and we expect that the court will agree with us in this regard. But we have to be very clear-eyed about the need to make sure that universal service can be sustainable. In the long haul, we believe that we have to expand, actually, the base of contributors that are providing support for USF beyond the very small slice of telephone and voice providers via internet in order to do so. And we're really looking forward to working with you and this committee in ensuring the FCC has the authority to be able to expand that base.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Powell, I had a very interesting discussion with some of your coworkers. I'm going to ask you to be a futurist for a quick second.
Okay.
I think about the global race to develop quantum computing. And I don't know how far off we are. I don't know whether the U.S. is going to win it. I certainly hope we do, because it has such important consequences. But that said, what does the telecom industry do to sort of prepare for that day, for emerging technologies? And what should we be thinking of as members of Congress to pave the way for safe implementation in the future?
Fascinating question. I think there are two dimensions that I would focus on. First of all, it's literally a quantum leap in technological capability. It's hard to foresee conceivably what it could mean. The first thing from my familiarity with it is the ability to hack encryption, which is potentially dangerous. A lot of encryption is built on the premise that a computer would take decades and decades to crack it so that it's safe. If you have a quantum computer that can do those calculations at an exponentially faster rate, you can have a lot of vulnerable systems in America to that kind of hacking. So our members are focused on what will be encryption for the future, and that's going to be a really, really critical area. I think the other thing, managing communications is essentially a mathematical formula. There's all kinds of algorithms that determine congestion, routing patterns, to the extent that quantum computing can improve the efficacy and effectiveness of this. It probably means we could have ultimately much, much, much faster network with much higher capacity and much lower latency, which should be the holy grail for all infrastructure providers.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Young, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank our panelists for being here today. We've spent tens of billions of dollars on important infrastructure investments, particularly broadband funding in recent years, spanning various federal agencies. And this committee has a really important oversight role. I commend the chairman for his leadership in this effort. The infrastructure bill alone made a $65 billion investment in broadband deployment and adoption, and established, as has been noted, a roughly $42.5 billion broadband grant program at the NTIA. I want to ask a couple of questions of Mr. Powell and Mr. Spalter, please. You represent many member companies who would likely consider participating in the BEAD program, this grant program to states. Do your members want to participate in the BEAD program, and how is your industry prepared for this new funding? And perhaps you could touch on any regulations associated with the requirements of the BEAD program or other government broadband programs that are of particular focus to your members.
Let me begin, Senator, and thank you for the question. Our members are, if I could use this phrase, loaded for bear to be able to actually deploy these BEAD dollars responsibly, accountably, quickly, and effectively. It is our members who have the financial, technical, operational and experiential wherewithal to be able to best apply these funds and put them to their best and highest uses. We are anticipating broad participation in the BEAD program. We are concerned, however, that there are unintended consequences of the IIJA that need to be dealt with squarely, including provisions that I don't believe Congress had intended to be included in the BEAD program or its implementation, such things as Davis-Bacon, the middle-class subsidy that has been suggested. We need to, together, collectively deal with these issues if we're going to foster the kinds of deep participation that we want and that our members would very much like to be able to achieve.
Thank you. Mr. Powell?
I would just add the tenor of your question gets at something I think is not fully appreciated. This is a massive, complex undertaking for an ISP. You have teams dedicated, first of all, just digesting the rules, the conditions, the parameters, the markets that are going to be available, which ones are not going to be available, you know, how is it going to be funded, where are the matching funds coming from, how do we do this in an inflationary environment that might lead to recession, how do we do this in a supply chain constrained environment, how do you do this in a skilled labor shortage environment, what are the ways to migrate around those things?
Right.
So, you know, this is why the delicacy of unnecessary regulatory mandates could really derail the incentive to participate.
Yeah, absolutely. So we will we'll note whatever regulations or provisions you think are already perhaps unintentional or not reflective of the intent of Congress as a whole. On an ongoing basis, we'll want to be attentive to some friction that will be associated with implementation, I'm sure, at various points. One question to, again, each of you, Mr. Powell and Mr. Spalter, pertaining to the digital divide, something we in Congress have indicated that we want to close for some period of time. But what does closing the digital divide mean to you? And do you believe that we will officially, through this spending and implementation initiative, be able to close the digital divide after, you know, tens of billions of dollars? Because frankly, this was the promise of the broadband investments, which was we would make sure there are no unserved, and we would significantly narrow the number of underserved households across the country. I expect inflation, which Mr. Powell mentioned, could have an adverse role on meeting that objective. But what say you, Mr. Salter?
To the question of how do we close the digital divide and what is closure of the digital divide, I think it's been well expressed by the intent of the IIJA itself, which is that when all in America who want access to broadband can have that access at speeds of 120 throughput at least. To get to that promised land, I think, you know, it's tantalizingly close. But it's going to take an all-hands-on-deck effort to make sure that we can, in partnership with our government partners, really machete through a lot of these encumbrances that make our willingness to participate in question because of the various regulatory, permitting, and other challenges that we know are part and parcel, unfortunately, right now of broadband deployment.
Okay, so your answer is basically we hope. We hope we can close the digital divide. We all need to be working together and towards that end. But you certainly haven't given me a confident assertion it's going to happen, which is fair. Mr. Powell?
Yeah, I think closing the digital divide is every American, regardless of where they live, whatever their community, has the ability to access high-quality broadband infrastructure at a reasonable rate. That's the historic commitment of the nation to universal service. And when we fully realize that dream, that will be the result. I am more excited and bullish than I've ever been that we have the opportunity to generally close the divide. I've also learned that declaring mission accomplished prematurely is a huge mistake. A lot of this money could be misdirected, inefficiently managed. We've seen that before. I think that the history of that anxiety should produce a much sharper, more vigilant, more better overseen program. If we do that, I think we will be able to celebrate the closing of the digital divide. If not, we'll be wondering 5 years from now what happened.
You have your game face on. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Senator Young. Next, we'll hear from Senator Rosen.
Well, thank you, Chairman Luján. I really appreciate you and for holding this important hearing today. You know, I'm one of the authors of the broadband section of the bipartisan infrastructure law, including the Middle Mile Broadband Deployment Act. So I want to ensure that we meet the law's goals. Nevada is home to vibrant rural communities like Ely, Lovelock, and Pahrump, where residents are really counting on the new infrastructure law to bring long-awaited high-speed broadband to our state. Broadband access is not just a communications issue. It's an economic issue, it's a workforce issue, it's a public safety issue, and it's a healthcare issue. And that's why I'm so severely disappointed by the recent broadband maps released by the FCC, which vastly overstate current coverage in rural Nevada. Broadband funding, it is directly tied to these maps, so we need to get this process right. That means ISPs must be forthcoming about where they actually serve. But it also means that the FCC challenge process must accept challenges based on actual engineering and the facts on the ground, not whether merely an ISP can theoretically serve a particular community. Actual facts, not theoretical. Because our constituents, they are counting on us, all of us, to get this right, and I'm going to continue to work with the FCC chairwoman until we do so. So thank you. I'm going to turn now for my question to the witnesses. So we do want to ensure success in digital equity programs. And so to fully participate in our modern world, our constituents need not just access to affordable high-speed internet, but also to those connected devices and digital skill sets to navigate diverse technologies and online services. Again, as one of the 22 senators who worked on the bipartisan infrastructure law, we understood the importance of taking that tailored approach to digital equity, ensuring that there are programs for every local community's unique needs. It means addressing affordability, digital literacy, digital hygiene, upskilling, all of the above. So, Ms. Seifer, one of the challenges I've heard from stakeholders in Nevada is finding community partners in rural areas. Even communities that receive federal funding through the Digital Equity Act state capacity grant we created, they still need help finding partners with the capacity to implement digital inclusion programming. So, Ms. Seifer, how do you approach working with these communities to meet their needs? We want to be sure everybody gets what they need to thrive.
First, Senator Rosen, I have to thank you on behalf of the digital equity community for your work on the bipartisan infrastructure law. We really appreciate everything you did. In rural communities, it is more difficult because those resources of those who are already providing digital inclusion programming may not already be there. So the stakeholder engagement process that has to occur, that process is a way to find those who can do the programming. Some of them may already exist. They may be doing digital inclusion work, but we may not know that they're doing digital inclusion work because they don't call it digital inclusion. They may call it something else. But also that stakeholder engagement process is a way to educate those who are already serving the populations, the covered populations that are supposed to be part of all of this, and then they can become part of the solution. They can integrate it into their other programming, and the reason that that's going to be so valuable is because of the trust that they already have with those covered populations. And part of what NDIA does is that training. So we offer ourselves to your community members.
Well, I want to continue on this stakeholder engagement process because we want to ensure success in digital affordability programs as well, because despite areas where broadband affordability support is needed most and could have the greatest benefit, our rural areas sometimes have the lowest participation in the Affordable Connectivity Program, those enrollment rates. And so it's available, people aren't enrolling. So how, again, do we reach out to everyone, let them know that these programs are there? What are the strategies you can use to be sure that we increase enrollment in our rural areas?
It really goes back to those trusted intermediaries. So the ones that are already talking to the covered populations. There are those who aren't always trusted, right? And no offense to my colleagues, like maybe the internet service provider saying that this is something available may not be the right way to go. Because free sounds like a scam, right? But if your librarian is telling you about it, or your teacher is telling you about it, or the individual over at the extension center is telling you about it, that you might trust.
Well, thank you. I think we really, I'm going to submit the rest of my questions for the record, but I really think getting this information out through trusted sources up and down our states, urban and rural, it is so important that everybody gets the digital access that they need. Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator Rosen. Next, we'll hear from Senator Tester.
Well, thank you, Chairman Luján and Ranking Member Thune for having this hearing, and I want to express my appreciation to the panelists for their testimony. I'm going to start with you, Mr. Powell. You already pointed out that there's a lot of money, a record amount of money going in to lay down broadband to get everybody connected up. From your seat, what is the biggest barrier for internet service providers?
I think the biggest barriers is you need critical inputs to actually operate in these parts of the country. Those critical inputs are permitting, which we've talked a lot about today. I would offer some additional suggestions for improving that, not only trying to create a much deeper coordination among federal agencies for federal lands, a harmonized set of access fees, but I would also add making sure those agencies are staffed with the people. We often call these agencies and we're told, we don't have enough people to work on that, we'll do your permit next year. And that's just kind of unacceptable with the urgency of this program. The second area that we've touched on, which I think is critical, is access to polls at reasonable rates. We do have a federal regulatory regime that regulates reasonable rates for polls, but there are exemptions in that law, and many of those exempted entities have conflicts of interest in allowing new entering providers from accessing those polls. That becomes a very, very, very serious problem for anybody hoping to reach these areas. So continued focus by the FCC, the Congress on permitting and polls, we think is the principal and primary obstacle to utilizing the money effectively.
So I think this is a fair statement. Like in a lot of laws and oversight, there's a few folks out there that create problems for everybody else. And one of the problems that we're concerned about, that you're concerned about, and so am I, is building on top of a broadband that's already there. My question to you is that, and I think because of that, I mean, we're seeing you have to dot the I's twice and cross the T's 3 times because there are some folks out there that are going to take federal dollars and they're going to overbuild on top of other existing lines. While the testimony was being given today, it occurred to me that isn't some of the responsibility on the folks that are requesting the money, or do you just not know where the service is, so you're just going to build it out? Answer me which one of those statements is true. Do we have companies, and that's for you, Mr. Powell, do we have companies out there that are getting the money knowing damn well that the service is already there, but they can get the money and, you know, pocket a little administration fees and make some money? Or is it a situation where the maps are so bad that even the companies don't know which areas are served?
I think both can be true. I think the efforts to make the maps more sophisticated, precise, and granular is going to significantly diminish or mitigate that consequence. Look, I've been involved in these programs for 30 years. I guarantee you there are companies out there who believe that they can acquire resources and subsidies, find a way to build in economically sustainable areas, which often include areas where broadband already exists, pocket that profit and get away with it successfully. They've done it in the past, in past programs, without sufficient rigor and accountability for those kinds of things. And shame on us if they're able to do it a third time, despite Congress, at least in the BEAD program, expressing quite clearly and intentionally the desire to take care of the neediest first, and only when that job is done to move to underserved areas, and only when that job is done, consider other possible uses of the money. The question is, will we rigorously adhere to that scheme, or will it be eroded through the implementation across multiple jurisdictions over time?
right? And look, I think the dollars are there to get everybody connected up with good service. But if it's not used correctly, then that's a problem. And I think I can't speak for the agencies because I do oversight. I don't do their work, but I think that's probably part of the reason why permitting is so onerous, because I want to try to make sure that people aren't doing this. I want to move on to something else, and this is for Ms. Seifer. The bipartisan infrastructure bill that, quite frankly, I helped write and got passed requires some broadband labels. I looked at the label. I think it's great if you know what you're looking at. But quite frankly, it tells you about download speeds and upload speeds and all those kind of things. But to a regular person, that doesn't mean much. Do you think these broadband labels are going to be effective? Or do you think we need to take another run at it?
I think the broadband labels have an opportunity, a potential to be effective, but we also need to be educating all of our community members as to what these things mean. As this technology keeps changing, we're gonna have to figure out how to keep educating each other. And it's really complicated, but we can't just be like, well, somebody else knows all the answers.
Right on. I just want to thank you guys very, very much. This is a big, big issue. We have an opportunity to do a lot of good stuff and create a lot of jobs and economy in the process if it's done right. Appreciate all your input. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Tester. Next, we'll hear from Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here today. I'm sure you can tell from the hearings this is an issue that's hits home all the time, and certainly that's no different. For me, in a rural area of West Virginia, who has some of the lowest broadband deployment, unfortunately. So I'm going to start with Mr. Spalter. Senator Klobuchar and I introduced the Rural Broadband Protection Act earlier this year. This legislation would require a more vigorous vetting and verification process for internet service providers seeking to participate in the FCC high-cost programs. And I think you all are in support of this. The issue is, for years, we've had money go out to certain providers that in the end can't either A, provide the service, or it gets too expensive, or for whatever reason, it doesn't get deployed there. That's what I'm trying to get with this bill. Let's pre-vet before we go ahead. So could you speak to that issue for me, please?
I think that the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund in its first iteration is proof positive that we have to do better and be more aggressive in ensuring that we're properly vetting providers for their financial, technical, operational, and even experiential wherewithal, which is why we support your legislation that would do more to pre-vet providers. This is, as we all have expressed, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get the work done, and we cannot be doing science experiments with these dollars.
No, we really can't. Mr. Powell, do you have a comment on that, from what you see from your perspective?
I would say I really endorse your instincts here. I mean, I think broadband is way more difficult and complicated to provision than people realize. It requires deep levels of engineering, technical expertise, and more importantly, a commitment to the long term. I think there's a tendency to believe that you dig a hole, you build a line once, and you're done with this. We spend $19 billion every single year just on upgrades, changes, and innovations. Mm-hmm. You have to make sure someone who's entering the program is able to sustain that for a meaningful amount of time. What we often see is they come in, you can get the money to build, constructing it once is one thing, and then cannot keep going for the long.
Right, and that's one of the concerns I have. I'm not saying every municipality might have an issue for this, but this could be an issue in certain. We don't have a whole growth industry in our state of municipalities wanting to do this because they realize it has to be a regional approach. You have to have not just the expertise, but the money to maintain. It doesn't just stop once you get the delivery. So I think that's a sort of a side issue to this. If I could talk about the mapping again, I had a joint meeting, and the West Virginia Broadband Enhancement Council has done a great job on trying to pre-map our state. But when the maps came out, it looked as though 138,000, we have 1.8 million, so 900,000 residents or something around that. So 138,000 locations looked to have been left out. And I think this is a national problem. So when do we expect these to actually be finalized? Because the money really can't go out by our desire until these are complete. Is that correct, Mr. Powell or Mr. Spalter?
Yes, that's correct. I mean, the general expectation is the final maps will come out in the spring. Some people say March, some people say April. The distribution of funds, NTIA has said at the end of June. So we really are in a crunch period beginning now, particularly submissions that are due on January 13th, in order to give the FCC a genuine opportunity to produce a next round of maps that's more accurate and reflects the concerns that you're raising. I would want to highlight one thing to clarify. The FCC is the one determining the locations of the fabric. You know, that is not being provided by the ISP. So a lot of these problems are in this complex process of the fabric that we can help with, but that data is being collected separately from the data we provide.
Right. Go ahead, Mr. Spalter.
Well, I would just add to that that the review and challenge process absolutely plays a critical role in ensuring that we're going to be actually able to have maps that will be fully functional. And it would be a complete undermining of the law if the NTIA were to move forward with maps that had not been subject to that rigorous review process, which is why I think that this kind of oversight is extremely important in ensuring that we can actually have maps that are viable, scalable, universal, and harmonized across the country.
Yeah, we've been really pushing through our office the website on the FCC where you can actually put your home address in, and I would encourage people to do that, especially when you've got, well, in any case, but in the more rural areas, it's easy to miss. Addresses are different, and we need to get that granular data. And I'm really appreciative that the state data that's coming forward with what the ISPs are delivering and others has really, I think, enhanced this. But we're still, some of ours are getting missed. So I appreciate everything you're doing, and thanks for the answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Next, we'll hear from Senator Lummis for her question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and welcome, panel. My first question is for Mr. Powell and Ms. Sikwa-Kwaptua. Did I get it right? I'm so sorry.
Yes, you did, Sikwa-Kwaptua.
Okay, well, I'm from Wyoming, and as you know, Wyoming and the West face unique challenges that can impact the availability of broadband services and probably create additional costs. You know, sometimes our equipment is in remote areas when it needs to be repaired, hard to get maintenance to that kind of equipment in some of our areas, and that can cause additional costs, or service goes down. So what costs disproportionately impact rural and tribal areas when it comes to deploying broadband services? What are you seeing out there?
For the tribal areas, you're absolutely correct with the rugged nature. If you look at the state of New Mexico on Highway 40, goes into Arizona, and about 60, maybe 90 miles from that border, it's lava. So constructing in that requires advanced equipment that's more expensive. And I think that's probably one of the biggest elements that, you know, we battle when we put in our, when we design our projects. The permitting is also a challenge. I will say, though, that, you know, with the recent federal efforts with the Permitting Council, there's more of a mechanism to coordinate the federal agency permits, and that's going to be a huge time savings, which also can have cost components as well. But we look forward to working with these new initiatives that have made broadband projects eligible for this project or for their Permitting Council's process, and are optimistic that we can reach our delivery goals for our tribal broadband connectivity project, whose time frame had to be extended by was allowed to be extended up to 4 years, as opposed to the initial NOFA, which had a 1-year project. Now, for our project costs there, we're going to look at some administrative costs that were unexpected for that longer time frame, and that has a lot to do with the supply chain issues, wherein I just ordered, you know, a couple million feet of fiber with a 2-year delivery date.
Is permitting more difficult in Indian country?
It is. We also have the Bureau of Indian Affairs that we need to work with. So that can be, that is another process that we just have to factor in. So when we look at, reforms and coordinations, the BIA did sign an MOU to work on these projects, but it's time and education also within the agencies. You might have that conversation at the federal level, and we've heard some of the witnesses speak to that, but then once the management down to the people processing and receiving paperwork, until they're trained and they're meeting their timeframes, we're going to continue to see barriers.
Is it necessary to have BIA involved in this? Is this an area where BIA could be more of an impediment than a help?
Yes and no. I think that BIA does play an important role here. Not all tribes are the same. We're sovereign nations. Some of us have more resources and more internal capabilities and capacity. And for those tribes that can move forward, a lighter touch with the BIA is absolutely fair.
And does the BIA adapt itself to the differences among tribes and their self-governance capabilities?
Yes, they do. They try to do that. The BIA also has a role, though, I think, for the least resource tribes. For instance, with spectrum acquisition, this is something where tribes have not had access to sovereign rights over what could be considered a natural resource like water. So now as we move forward into the telecommunication space and we're trying to negotiate in the secondary markets, perhaps there's a band of spectrum that we would like to utilize, and we know that it's not being utilized by the license holder. There was an order to the effect to allow tribes the opportunity to utilize that underused spectrum, but where does a tribe begin, especially if it's a low resource tribe? How do we engage in those processes? We're not going to be able to without additional structures of support, and BIA has the opportunity to grow and help us with that process.
Okay, well, I hope you'll reach out to the committee because you're knowledgeable in this area, and let us know if there are areas where we should require a lighter touch of the BIA with regard to regulation and layers of bureaucracy in this area that might prevent a company from accessing a broadband project in Indian country. Mr. Powell, same question for you, maybe a little less focused on tribal lands.
Yeah, I think states like yours are the most challenging. Number one, for geography. These are complex terrains to wire and connect, and those are unique challenges. Permitting, as you mentioned, pole access, as we've discussed, all are significant problems we're running into those communities. The availability of skilled labor to work often in remote regions is challenging as well. And then I think an area we haven't talked enough about across the whole country is this continuing backup in the supply chain, which is really becoming quite problematic, I think, for all of us.
Thank you. I've run over, so I might submit additional questions in writing. Hey, thank you all for being here.
Senator Lummis, thank you very much. Mr. Powell, I had asked Mr. Spalter a question about data caps, and I have the same question for you as well. Yes or no, do some of your members maintain data caps or data throttling on their consumer broadband offerings?
Not data throttling. Some of our members do employ data caps. One of the reasons is our networks are shared, meaning in a neighborhood, everyone is drinking from the same broadband network. If one user were to overuse that broadband, it would diminish the experience of others in the community. So some of our carriers use caps to manage and prevent that situation.
But if a network is properly built, there's plenty of data for everybody. To me, just so you know, data caps to me are like long distance calling. When my mom is going to make a long distance call, I encourage her to use her mobile device so she doesn't have to pay for that long distance call like she would if she had to use her landline. There shouldn't be long distance calling in America. And that's a fundamental flaw with USF. I don't want to get into all of those problems. But everything that I'm aware of from network build-out and construction, given technological advances, is there's plenty out there if it's constructed correctly. Is that an incorrect assumption I'm making?
I don't want to call it incorrect. Some networks are fixed connections to a home, and they're not affected by the use of homes next door. Cable networks are largely shared, which means the way they're constructed and designed, one home can affect the quality of what's available in another home. This also happens in multi-dwelling units. So for example, in the days when you had someone running a BitTorrent server in their basement and were downloading tons of illegal music, could that degrade the experience of people sharing that backbone connection? Absolutely, that is true. That's why those that do have caps, the caps are extraordinarily high. Very few people ever reach them or ever will reach them, and they're done for network management reasons. Now, to be fair, many of our companies don't do them. It's an individual business decision, so we don't have some opinion that they're all necessary, not necessary. These are decisions companies make to manage their networks in the communities they serve.
I appreciate that. I appreciate the response that says that, well, if they have them, they're high, so people may not hit them. The reason that I'm asking this question to you, Mr. Spalter, and to you, Mr. Powell, is during the last couple of years with what children were faced with, distance education, educators who were conducting their classrooms from their homes, especially in the most rural parts of the country where their technology may have been a line of sight shot from some provider that couldn't get to them, maybe because of easements, things of that nature. But nonetheless, they were constrained with caps. I've spoken to a number of teachers and a number of students whose parents or household thought that they had purchased a good enough plan so that they would not be hit with additional fees, things of that nature, or hit the data caps. I was really surprised with the number of educators in New Mexico, a number of kids that did hit those caps, and then they could not afford to go higher. And the reason I'm asking that is with the work that we're doing here, it's about equitable access.
Yeah.
And to me, if a household with students hit that cap and they can't participate in school, that does not feel to me like equitable access. Yeah. And so that I introduced a piece of legislation called the Uncap America Act, looking at this specifically. I mean, I think even your largest member did not deploy data cap plans in all of their states, although there's a question of, 21 or 22, or if in the future, if that may happen. But it was a recognition that it was not needed everywhere. And to your point, Mr. Powell, that not all of your members use that as well. And that's the same with you, Mr. Spalter. Not all of your members have data cap plans available to customers as well. But nonetheless, I hope that that's something that we can look at going forward, given network build-outs, what we're now seeing with further reaches. And if data caps continue at the rate that we saw them during COVID, there's going to be a lot of folks still left out. And I'm hoping that that may be something we can work towards. Ms. Sikaptiwa, how do we best ensure students across New Mexico and around the nation have equal access to education, especially and specifically as it pertains to access to broadband, distance education, responsibilities, things of that nature?
Oh, I think that we learned, and thank you for that question. I think we've learned through the pandemic that it's all about residential internet access. During the pandemic, when and I'm not sure how it is in other states, but in our tribal lands in New Mexico, physical barricades were put up at the entrance to our tribal lands. This was to prevent traffic for people coming in, and possibly with the sickness, but it was also to protect us from going out. And the problem with that was that our students who were going to the McDonald's and the Starbucks, they could no longer have that access. Once the tribal library shut down, we were told to stay, in our homes, in our bubble, and not even with our extended families, to also protect ourselves. So the internet that we had in our homes was the only lifeline we had for remote learning. And as I mentioned earlier, 89% of our students did not have it. We cobbled together what we could with the mobile hotspots once their prices went down. But really, we need affordable, permanent, residential services in our communities. That's the only way that we're going to be able to ensure adequate participation for our students in K-12. Recent leading research is connecting broadband availability to student attainment and post-secondary pursuits. Yeah. After the pandemic, we're not going backward. Remote learning is here to stay. The expectation that students will be carrying devices and will be completing homework, at home and collaborating with their peers at night is just the new normal. So as we want to prepare our students for success, it's to have their availability to the internet as a universal service in their homes. And just real quickly, what we do, how we use the internet is also changing in education. I mentioned the state education networks. We now have our tribal libraries connected over gigabit connections to institutions of higher education in New Mexico, to the research and education networks. Ours in New Mexico is called the Albuquerque Gigapop. They peer with all the higher ed institutions. So when we have this residential internet connections and these high-speed connected anchor institutions, we're now connecting our educational spaces to international high-speed education and research networks. So when we talk about workforce training and we talk about building the next generation of IT professionals, it's all part of that greater conversation.
I appreciate that, and my familiarity with those networks, and that's part of the brilliance is you made a decision based on the lack of connectivity when you were initially working on the tribal library. I believe it sent which pueblo was it? The first tribal library that you worked on?
Santo Domingo.
Santo Domingo, which I believe we had a chance to visit, and then you saw how you could continue to expand that opportunity pueblo to pueblo. But by building your own network, you could get to that gigapop, if you will. You could get to that access point and have the fastest speeds available to people in the community. So I just want to thank you and continued success with your expansion in that area. There's been some specific questions around the mapping. And while I agree with Chairman Powell that I applaud that the FCC has moved forward and we have some data now, we're clearly seeing where aspects of the country are missing from what that was able to capture. And as I pointed out at my opening, Cochiti Pueblo, Shiprock, New Mexico, completely left out. And in New Mexico, the office has said that as many as 37,000 locations in New Mexico are unaccounted for. So how best can we enable our local communities to engage the FCC and take advantage of the challenge process as intended?
Thank you for pointing out some of our challenges in New Mexico. When we moved to the residential-based reporting, the granular reporting, that's good. That's an opportunity. But it ties into other nuances that also have to be solved for. In our tribal lands, we don't necessarily have street addresses, So how are we going to match that P.O. box to that underserved home? So we're having to look at the systems that we use to build the maps and look at the methodologies and the challenges that lie therein. As chair of the Connect New Mexico Council, we've been looking at tribal engagement very seriously, and we need to put together, different teams. It's not just inviting tribal leadership, it's also a conversation with GIS specialists. Do the tribes even have GIS specialists? How are we going to work then with the IT departments? Who plays a role to do what? So it has to be a multi-pronged approach. And in particular, with respect to mapping, we have solutions. Let's create a help desk. People can call the FCC for help. People can call the state for help. But what we need to do is we need to go to each one of the coast communities, and we need to use our local networks and our trusted partners to invite them to workshops. We're planning 2 in the fall, one next week and then one right after Christmas, where we're going to bring together our tribal teams. We built an offline map that we're going to have that's interactive, and we're going to zoom in on our neighborhoods by having the people in those neighborhoods in the room, and we're going to identify those missing locations.
Well, let me ask you a follow-up to everything you just put on the table. Is the January 13th date established by the NTIA enough time?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, we're going to work like crazy until we hear that there's an extension, but we need more time to do it right. I know we desperately need broadband. I know that people are hurting and basic human services are being compromised until we can get broadband deployed as fast as possible, but also rushing into decision-making and creating funding allocations that might not be in the best interest of those same communities would be a miss, I think, for this generational opportunity we have with this funding.
I appreciate that very much. Now, providers looking to serve rural markets must typically pay more to connect each subsequent customer, right, as distances increases, as there's other challenges surrounding that. The FCC has interpreted its universal service mandate to include support for this high-cost build-out, as well as providing lifeline to low-income subscribers. NTIA's BEAD program and the Affordable Connectivity Program take these policies to the next level. They make the market work in these areas with federal support for capital expenditures and discounts to qualified households. Mr. Spalter, your testimony recommends Congress chart a sustainable future for the universal service, and it expresses support for the Fair Contributions Act, which we voted out of this committee in charting the path forward. Please answer whether the future of universal service includes the following priorities. Direct support for capital expenditures in rural and high-cost areas?
Yes.
Direct support for discounts for eligible households to cover the cost of monthly access?
Yes.
Direct support for telehealth and remote telemedicine?
Very much so, yes.
Direct support for affordable, resilient, and secure broadband for teachers and students wherever they access educational tools?
Absolutely.
Direct support for digital literacy, digital inclusion, and digital equity initiatives to ensure adoption follows closely behind access and affordability.
Yes.
I appreciate that, and I agree. And I'm hopeful that as we look for and create and identify together a permanent solution to close a digital divide, the investment is historic, but the funding for broadband in the bipartisan infrastructure bill is not permanent.
Mm-hmm.
The digital divide will not disappear when funding runs out. And I think that's an important conversation for all of us to face. I agree with what was presented by Senator Lummis, Senators Tester, Senator Young, Senator Thune, with and your written testimony about approval for access, for easement approval, especially amongst federal agencies and coordination. Recently, myself and Senator Barrasso wrote a letter to the Department of Interior along these lines. And this should not just be looked at from the perspective of broadband. On the Navajo Nation in New Mexico, we had a horrific rainstorm and a flood that resulted. A declaration of emergency was presented and adopted. FEMA authorized the funding, could not secure easement from BIA. The money was almost lost. What should have taken a year or two to get done with reestablishing a road that was dirt, but a bridge that was torn out because of the flooding, it took more than a decade. And that's why I appreciate the conversation of what we're talking about here. That cannot occur with this initiative. So I'm hopeful that we can address those issues as well. And Kimball, the first tribally owned telecom company began in South Dakota, which I've learned a lot more about, the Cheyenne River Sioux Tribe, when they bought a private company and founded their telecommunication authority. From New Mexico, Godfrey Anjari of Mesclero Apache, he leads the National Tribal Telecom Association. In the past, the Santa Fe Indian School has leveraged a model where tribal consortia have worked to build their own fiber networks. These consortia have reduced broadband costs by up to 95% and increased speeds dramatically. Do you believe tribally owned networks have empowered tribes and pueblos to build and sustain self-sufficient and thriving communities?
Absolutely. I think that the success of Maddie and the other tribal ETCs just speaks to the ability for tribal ISPs to participate successfully in the telecommunications space. In the consortia projects that I've done, we're new entrants into this space. I heard comments on concerns about sustainability after post-grant awards, and that's valid, that's fair. But we also need to look at how we're going to achieve sustainability as us tribes now are proving that we can build and maintain these networks. We have a very robust connections, fiber-based connections in these communities that I built in. The costs did go down by 95% plus, and the speeds went up by over 3,000%, and that was just turning our network on low. So I think we can do tremendous work when we do look at sustainability, and Godfrey, Mr. Njadi will be the first one to mention this. We need to come back with Congress and the FCC and look at paths for sustainable funding. Now, whether the ACP continues, hopefully, but also access to Lifeline. And if the barrier to that or a challenge is to become an ETC, maybe we can look at alternative models for in the regulatory framework where the ETC designation can be modified, because not all of the tribes want to provide voice. Broadband-only options serve these community needs adequately. So if we can look at some flexibility in accessing the USF funds, then I think that's going to speak largely to the sustainability of these networks.
I appreciate that. Before I come back to the other members of the panel, Senator Lummis does have another question.
Thanks very much, Mr. Chairman. It's nice to be able to take advantage of this panel's expertise while they're here. Sure appreciate it. Mr. Spalter, quick question about developing a location fabric. What are some of the difficulties you faced? We've covered some of them here today. Are there any we haven't discussed that the committee should be aware of? And then for the entire panel, how can the FCC best ensure that the broadband maps, which will be used to allocate BEAD funding, are accurate? So thank you again, with my thanks to the panel.
Recognizing the unfortunate history of previous broadband maps, U.S. Telecom endeavored to undertake a pilot program to actually evolve and deploy on a pilot basis location fabrics, both in Missouri and Virginia. We found that we can do so if we were aggressively seeking the types of data that need to contribute to more refined mapping processes, including not only open source data sets, but also proprietary data sets, geocoding, and other sophisticated data analyses that can actually inform the maps. We presented those pilots and the underlying location fabric to the FCC and are very glad that they've adopted that as the framework for the existing maps. We absolutely have an opportunity we hope, in a short time so that we can deploy dollars by the end of June to have a refined, accurate, and deeply granular set of maps because of things like the location coding, the location fabrics geocoding mechanisms that allow each structure to be identified in serviceable communities. So we will more accurately know where broadband is, but more importantly, where it isn't. And so we're confident and I would even say optimistic that the maps will actually be able to iterate to a place where we can have confidence in them as long as we continue collectively, not only as industry, but with our community partners and states, to work towards ensuring that the challenge process can move nimbly, quickly, and effectively.
Thank you. And would anyone else care to weigh in on my broader question? Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I think speaking to the goal of utilizing the map to close the digital divide speaks to not just the accuracy of what's on the map itself right now, but how we use the map and how we design it as a tool. I think that we have different for instance, I'm speaking from education, our schools and those anchor institutions, how are they being categorized on the map? How are other anchor institutions for health centers, for instance, how are they being characterized on the map? Because the map isn't just for baseline data, but it's also a planning tool. So the more dynamic it is, the more the anchor institutions are included, then we can design different broadband strategies that include the different sectors. And I think that that's what's going to help us realize America's broadband needs.
Can I add that most communities are not conducting the kind of challenging education process that Kimball is? So if we had more communities able to conduct that process, not only are they fixing the map, they're learning about broadband while they're there.
Yeah. Great panel. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Senator. To move past the question I asked Kimball, Mr. Powell, yes or no, do any of your companies intentionally discriminate when providing service?
No.
Mr. Spalter, same question.
Absolutely not.
I appreciate that. If a company were to intentionally discriminate, would that violate existing statute prior to passage of the IIJA? Mr. Powell?
Well, I think that would depend. There probably are race, gender, other kinds of discriminatory statutes that might reach that conduct depending on how onerous or how much animus was involved. Classic redlining in different formats is prohibited in different ways, so I'm just not familiar enough with all the things that are available that you could violate. But I do think the IIJA created a communications deployment architecture specific focus on that, and that will become more clear with the FCC's proceeding.
Appreciate that. Mr. Spalter?
Well, Section 60506 of the IIJA was very explicit in setting forth an anti-discrimination approach. We believe that intentional discrimination is the core principle that the FCC has to use to evaluate whether there's any discriminatory intent, is a viable one and must be the basis for its current proceeding. We have also found that intentional discrimination, as it is applied variously to rooting out discrimination in areas like housing, handicapped Americans, and real estate, I mentioned housing, and employment, is a viable standard and can be applied in this instance.
I appreciate that. If I was asked the question, if a company were to intentionally discriminate, if that would violate existing statute or passage of the IIJ, I would say yes. And the reason that I'm asking that particular question is with the proceeding now that's taking place, there are a lot of questions about clarification, things of that nature, it seems to me based on no one's intentionally discriminating, you represent the largest members in particular areas for connectivity, access to communication across America, that if that's the case, that it's not a problem and existing statutes already protect it. Would you agree with that, Mr. Spalter?
I would have to evaluate that with greater care, but generally speaking, if I could reiterate that under the context that none of our members have or have any intention to discriminate, we are confident that the intention of Section 60506 of the IIJA is sufficient to be a basis for the FCC rulemaking as long as it is based on intentional discrimination and its core principle.
Okay, I appreciate it. Mr. Powell, do you have any feedback there?
I would only add, Senator, that we're very confident that we would pass any test on digital discrimination because of the nature of the way we build our networks. We build into our entire footprints and have for many, many decades, and we upgrade consistently. I think we've shared data with your office that you can't find differences very easily between wealthy areas and low-income areas in most of our footprints, and you can't find many distinguishing factors between Hispanic or African American communities in those areas. So we feel very good that we build systematically, we serve everyone, it's in our DNA, and we'll work with the FCC to have a workable definition that we can all be clear that we're in compliance with, but we're confident we will meet that standard.
So as a follow-up to that, with the passage of legislation by the House and the Senate, do you believe Congress gave the FCC the authority to define and prevent digital discrimination in order to promote equal access to broadband with comparable speeds, latency, and other quality of service?
Yes, you did give them that authority, subject to technical and economic feasibility, but yes.
And the reason I'm asking that question is, as I shared with you when we've chatted before, the questions that I had surrounding one of the filings around safe harbors with recent rules as well. And the reason I'm asking that is, to me, it's concerning from the perspective of the history of digital redlining, as we've spoken about before, rural access and tribal telecom, that shows that companies' use of economic and technical feasibility to not serve entire neighborhoods or entire communities has been used. And I'm hoping that Mr. Spalter, did you have a reaction to that?
No, I was.
Okay. And what I'm hoping that moves forward here is that if in fact the intent, as has been agreed on by everybody, filings, press releases, public statements, things of that nature, is to connect to the country, that loopholes are not created such that they can be hid behind. In some communities where something is not economically feasible or not technically feasible, and I think in a previous filing even, Mr. Powell, NCTA filed that just because something is not technically feasible, that it doesn't mean that it's not economically feasible. Did I get that correct? This has been a few years. It's like back in 2019 or 2020, if I remember.
You might have me on that one.
We can come back to it. But nonetheless, it's been my experience as you know, I was a former member of the New Mexico Public Regulation Commission, which is the equivalent to public utilities in different parts of America. And in New Mexico, we were unique because we had insurance under us, like Vermont had banking underneath them. It was kind of interesting. Sorry to to describe those, but nonetheless, the work that I did with the PUCs at the time, I was very proud of. But it was my experience at the time, and even into the House, that when communities would be told that they could not be built, that it was not economically or technically feasible, and then they would just take it on their own, and then someone would come in and say, "Oh no, we can do it now." I just don't want to see that. I guess that's the point that I'm raising here, is a loophole that lets you say, "Nope, can't do it," and then someone does it, and then all of a sudden, it's possible as we work on these rules. And this is something that I'll be looking at closely with the rulemakings that are there to ensure that we don't have loopholes like that are created, because to have this investment at the level that it is, which could cure most of the problem. I'm still not convinced it'll cure all the problem. That will cure most of the problem of not having households connected, businesses, rural communities, first responders, all the rest in America. For then there to be loopholes that will guarantee that even though there is money, that it won't be connected. And that's one of my ultimate goals with wanting to have a hearing like this and bringing us all together. You all are going to be critically important to how this gets done. And I pray that it will be. I'm very familiar with the work that Kimball has done in New Mexico, having watched that for years, but especially now with some of the decisions that have been made, going back to the 2020 funding at NTIA, some of the spectrum allocations as well, especially in sovereign indigenous communities across the country, and how we can get that right. So I pray that we can just get this all done, but you're all critically important, and it means a lot to have you all here today. I do want to also thank Senator Thune for the work that he has done over the last few years that I've had, or a couple of years that I've had the honor of working with him as well on this subcommittee, and I hope to continue working with him in this and other areas. While we don't always vote the same, I very much appreciate the conversations I have with Mr. Thune and his team and how we've been able to work together. And what's Alex's last name? I also want to thank Alex. Alex Shokshin. See, Kimball, I have problems with everybody's name. But I also want to recognize Alex for his work and not only what he does for helping to prepare Mr. Thune, but the work that he does for the subcommittee with all of our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. As we all know, it's incredible staff that we all depend on every day to make a profound difference. And to all the staff that are here today, I just want to say thank you to each and every one of you. And happy holidays, stay safe. But you have a lot of work in front of you, so please work as much as you can. Thanks again, everyone. With that being said,